means. There are some people who need admitting, so perhaps will you deal with those? Great. Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this stream 3.4 on day 2 of CSEdX. And today we're looking at radical reimagination, or the CSEdX is certainly looking at radical reimagination. And in today's session, we have 4 excellent speakers. And before we go to them, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country, paying my respects to First Nations elders past, present and emerging across the many lands where Charles Sturt University campuses, students and staff are located. And in particular, I would like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Biripi peoples. I also pay my respects to any First Nations colleagues in this session today. So welcome to this session. As I said, we have 4 excellent speakers today. Robin Jarman will be talking about enhancing work-integrated learning for neurodivergent students in medical science. Rosemary Corrigan will talk about embracing our regional identity and supporting our future allied health workforce. And Yazdan Mansourian will speak to the concept of locality in Wenger's theory of communities of practice and how this informs work-integrated learning. And Stacey Jones will talk about enhancing teacher education students' readiness for professional experience placement and employment. So we'll get started and I will hand over to Robin, who should be able to share her screen. So I'll just stop sharing this one.
Okay, I'll just share my screen.
Over to you.
Is that in not presenter mode, hopefully?
Presenter, that's good.
It's in presenter mode or it's in full mode?
It's in
full mode.
Awesome.
Full mode.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Linda. And thank you everybody for having me here to speak at CSEdX. Today I'm speaking on behalf of myself and my colleague, Dr. Martin Powell, about enhancing work-integrated learning for neurodivergent students in medical science, our novel approach to clinical placement in pathology. So a bit of background, workplace learning is an essential part of the Bachelor of Medical Science Pathology, as it allows students to apply theoretical knowledge in a practical setting. As diagnostic pathology is a patient-focused industry, it's imperative that students are exposed to authentic scenarios that impact actual patient diagnosis and treatment. WPL also allows students to be immersed in their chosen profession and to begin performing a professional identity, which builds their confidence and enhances their perception of their own work readiness, employability, and their suitability to the industry. And it significantly improves graduate outcomes. So it's also important to note that while the emphasis of WPL has historically focused on bridging gaps between theory and practice, it also requires students to learn a large amount of social and emotional skills related to the workforce. Social and emotional learning is important for workplace culture, self-awareness, social awareness, relationship management, and ultimately people's job satisfaction. Also, we need to remember that organising placements is inherently challenging for all students. There's possible multiple sites per student. There's their personal, family and work commitments that need to be taken into account, their location, as many of our students are regional, and also financial strain that going on placement places on students. So this work was identified due to the experience of one student who had autism spectrum disorder, who in 2023-24 was undertaking her WPL subjects in pathology labs, and she required additional support to succeed. This student was given the impression early on in her degree that ASD would mean she was not suited to the industry and that placement could be a barrier to her educational success. But myself and Martin, it was very clear to us that this was not the case and that with the right support, she could absolutely succeed. So neurodivergence describes the way that a person's brain behaves differently from what we consider to be typical. It manifests in many ways and includes ASD and ADHD. Neurodivergent people may have unique social, behavioural and communication characteristics that can be an obstacle to higher education and employment success. However, literature shows that workforces are enriched by neurodiversity. Diverse groups encourage workplaces to fall out of the "this is how it's always been done" mindset, which is particularly essential in the sciences. And in many fields, companies are now actively recruiting neurodivergent people because of their unique abilities and their different ways of thinking about things. So why could work placement be challenging for neurodivergent students? Well, it's been our observation with this student, and now subsequently others, that the social and emotional aspects can prove really challenging. So difficulties with communication can be an obstacle to their success. Also, literature shows that certain sensory environments, unfortunately, like medical settings, can prove very overwhelming for some neurodivergent people. And while there is a variation, pathology labs are generally very large, brightly lit, and really noisy. They can also be extremely busy and stressful workplaces with multiple staff members present at every time. Therefore, multiple working relationships must be formed and maintained at each placement location. It should also be noted that while students are encouraged to, they are not required to submit an SAP to their subject coordinator. So there may be some neurodivergent students who are completely unaware that they need assistance, and/or they have trouble initiating those conversations needed to get the assistance, and they may have never reached out for support. So let's look at some of the current practices we have in WPL and the issues we identified with this student. The first point is that at the moment, WPL team contact the labs to set up placements for students. The problem here is, as a regional university with students all over Australia, many of these labs, the WPL team have never visited. So understanding the possible sensory and social and emotional challenges certain labs may present, we don't know about all of them. Secondly, once a placement is set up, the student is expected to contact the manager and make introductions. Some neurodivergent students, this step is insurmountable, actually making that first contact. Students are generally working 7-hour days, 5 days a week, and for some neurodivergent students, that workload is unmanageable. And students are expected to be autonomous in the lead up to and while on placement. And for some neurodivergent students, this means they have no guardrails and their expectations may not meet the reality, and communication breakdowns become likely. So how did we solve these issues? Well, regarding the location and the sensory considerations, we take careful consideration case by case of the suitable lab environment and the placement supervisor, even doing some site visits to the labs to make sure they were suitable. But regarding the initial contact, we solved this by setting up icebreaker meetings online between the student, the site manager, and our team, who the student is very familiar with, to make those introductions and to discuss expectations and limitations. The working hours problem, it was easy. We just offered flexible working arrangements. And regarding the autonomy, we do regular check-ins with our team, with the student and the supervisor, to help mitigate any communication breakdowns or misunderstandings. Some additional considerations. One is that normalising neurodivergence is essential. So now in the first week of placement subject sites being available to students, we post announcements regarding the CSU support services available with links to the relevant pages. And these announcements highlight the unique nature of placement subjects and encourage students with SAPs to come forward. We also found that WPL-focused SAPs may be of value. So we have made initial contact with the A&I office to have closer collaboration with our team regarding SAPs for pathology work placements, as they cannot be expected to understand the intricacies of all the different pathology lab environments. Also, regarding supervisor feedback, if necessary, the academic can discuss supervisor feedback with the student. This helps them put it into context and to mitigate any misunderstandings if there is constructive criticism. So the key takeaways from this was that firstly, the pedagogy of kindness and supportive and inclusive educational environments and the removal of stigma bolsters confidence in our students. And students with increased self-confidence have increased self-respect, which means they are true to themselves. They trust in themselves and their abilities. They believe that they can face challenges. They can better handle criticism, and they believe that they can succeed. And also we learnt that flexibility and willingness to make very minor accommodations based on a student's needs can be all that's needed to ensure their success. Basically, small changes make a really big difference. And it's a win-win scenario because not only does the student benefit, but the industry benefits as well, because neurodivergent individuals offer unique perspectives and skills. They have problem-solving abilities, they have attention to detail, they have out-of-the-box thinking, and all of this is of benefit to the industry. Secondly, we need to change the deficit discourse. So employer perspectives must shift from thinking that neurodivergence is a deficit to realising that it's actually a strength. And we feel that successful placement experiences for neurodivergent students can help make this shift. So some supervisor feedback from our single student case study that started this journey. And you can see here, there's amazing feedback about communication skills that we were worried about originally. A huge success, given that at the beginning of this WPL journey, the student was anxious and questioning her academic and career choices. I also just spent 3 days with this student in her final intensive school, and the increase in her confidence and improvement in her social skills was absolutely tangible. Obviously, nothing ever happens in a vacuum, so I would like to thank some people with whom their help this student's success story would not have been possible. Katie Allen, our amazing WPL admin officer, and Rachel and Shannon from the Accessibility and Inclusion Office, and also all of our wonderful students. And thank you very much. That's my talk done.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Robin. That was really interesting. And I'll look forward to hearing what questions people might have after the session is finished. Well done. Our next speaker is Rosemary Corrigan, who's going to speak about embracing our regional identity and supporting our future allied health workforce. So I'll hand over to you, Rosemary, if you would like to share your screen.
Yes, which is, oh, here we are. There it is. Right, there you go. Can you see it? Yes. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes,
Perfect,
okay.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to share information or from a project that we undertook with Three Rivers Department of Rural Health on our student placement experiences, but particularly around allowing our students to have sustained experiences within our rural footprint, and via the opportunity of undertaking placements through our rural clinical schools. So since about 2017, we have been offering a clinical school model for our fourth-year physiotherapy students. Our physiotherapy students undertake 5, it used to be 4, but now it's 5 placements in their final year. All are competency-based, and with a focus on developing capacity within our footprint, but also offering students an opportunity to have a year planned out for them. They knew where they were going. It would be an opportunity to save money and to work around their placement experiences. We developed this model of a clinical school, which was initially based in Wagga, and it's still ongoing. And it was also an opportunity to provide exposure for our students, because we do know from literature that graduates perceive rural and remote practice as rather nuanced. It's challenging, and so a rural placement can often give context to those areas that really are amplified in rural and remote practice. So we have Wagga, and now we include Albury, Forbes, Parkes and Bathurst in our clinical school program. Entry to the clinical schools is competitive and students must submit an EOI. The trigger for this project was educators saying, oh, I just knew that student would be a good fit. And I thought, now what does a good fit look like? And obviously it was very implicit based on the educators' perceptions of their own experiences in rural practice. So I thought it was a good opportunity to actually unpack what that good fit looks like. So the research gaps that drove most of this project, but I've refined for the purpose of this presentation, are what are the skills or attributes supervisors are looking for in physiotherapy students who undertake an interview to engage within the clinical school model. There are other aspects to the project which we've unpacked, but for the purpose of today's presentation, we've just got this particular one area of the interview that we're going to focus on for the purpose of today. There are other things. What are the drivers? What the clinical school model does for enhancing capabilities, and also the intentions of students to practice in a rural area. There were other offshoots for the project as well. So the project was a mixed methods project. So we actually undertook an online questionnaire for students, 14 of whom had completed placements within the clinical school model over 22 and 21. And then we had an online questionnaire for clinical supervisors and clinical school coordinators. But then we also did a deep dive into focus groups with those clinical supervisors and also WPL or Will academics within CSU. And with those particular focus groups, things like what are your expectations of the students? What do you believe are the capabilities that students require? How do you support students? So it was very nuanced and really to try and unpack some of the aspects of the capabilities in this instance that we were trying to explore. So using a template from the Martin and Mandrusiak article, which is the reference is listed below on this slide, they actually undertook a project of their own to look at the skill levels required for entry-level physiotherapists in a rural setting. And what we did was we took those particular items or capabilities that were identified to the clinical supervisors, who are asked to rate their level of agreement with the clinical school, that the clinical schools provide students with an opportunity to develop entry-level competencies in these clinical school models. Overall, obviously, most of the supervisors agreed that the clinical schools provided development in those particular areas. For example, the capacity to practice flexibly, to understand the needs of the community, to manage their own health and resilience, to maintain integrity as a healthcare professional in the community. So they felt they had agreements with those particular items that were originally developed by Martin and Mandrusiak and Forbes in their research. And so it was really interesting to find out how they felt that their clinical school offered opportunities in those areas. Then we also asked the students, were asked to rate their level of agreement that the clinical schools provided opportunities for them to develop entry-level competencies for effective rural and regional practice. 4 students completed this questionnaire, so it is a small number because obviously the students were not compelled to undertake this research, but the information that was provided was very, very helpful. It's also interesting to think that sometimes they had a greater perception of what the benefits were than sometimes the educators did. So that was really interesting. So managing their own health and resilience, they felt it was great, whereas educators probably didn't have such a strong level of agreement. But still, the students certainly enjoy the clinical school model in rural and remote areas. And the anecdotal feedback that we get from the students is very, very positive. Obviously, we always need anyone who's working in will know when a student fails, the feedback is never any never positive, but generally the student success rate is very high when they undertake these placements because there's a genuine drive to be based in a rural and remote area. So we've got this overarching desire to go back to those communities, and that often is a driver for students to go into the clinical schools. So that can possibly impact those findings to a degree. So there were a number of skills that were identified, but possibly the top 4 were the ones that were most predominant in the positive nature, in the positive feedback we got from educators and students. So the kicker for me is, I would say they're all important, regardless of the setting to a degree. You always want students to be able to practice flexibly wherever they are. So my question, and like any project, you often have more questions than answers, I think. And I think this is where we are moving towards now. So flexibility is an important part of any clinical area when we send students to, and they graduate and go and work. But are we thinking flexibility the same for a metropolitan setting, or flexibility uniquely tied to a rural or remote setting? So I think the capability is the same, but does it look different, is what I'm asking. So are these skills the same for all students, regardless of the setting, but amplified because of rurality and resources? So do we actually signpost those particular capabilities as a little bit more a stronger requirement for students? What opportunities can we provide to develop and grow these skills in clinical schools? So what do we need to do within the clinical school model that starts to set the student on a path to developing these capabilities? And are there any desirable capabilities relevant to rural clinical practice? Having said that, if we go from rural to remote, we might say that cultural competence is much more a need in a remote setting than perhaps a rural setting. Perhaps in a remote setting, the fact that the student may have to be a leader or the graduate, would have to be a leader in tasks rather than in a rural setting where there may be more mentorship available. So there might be a sliding scale of these capabilities that we need to consider. We also know that good communication skills are very essential regardless, and to build rapport with patients and other health professionals. But do rural and remote differ in a way? So I think this project has really unpacked for us what educators are seeing as implicit when they're interviewing students, but it also gives us an opportunity to actually expand and explore this a little bit more. And resilience, I think resilience is across the mainstream something that students sometimes struggle with. The curveball, the lack of predictability, and my colleagues and I often have a conversation about how can we embed resilience training. I think will is so different to academic work. Academic work, they know for 13 weeks when their assessment items are going to be held, what the assessment items are, and then we turn around and say, off you go, walk into that ward, see that patient for the first time, you've only got half an hour to read the notes, off you go. And so we really throw them in the deep end, and sometimes the difference between both contexts of learning, as in academia and will, sometimes creates a richness, but it also does create some challenges for students depending on their learning style and how they flourish. So some of the themes that came through when we looked at the focus groups and the discussions. So educators talked about students having to understand the boundaries and roles and their advocacy role for other allied health disciplines, and particularly in rural and remote settings. Social versus professional boundaries, treating a patient yet meeting their family in the pub. So all of these other dimensions come in. Working across multiple sites, often travelling to sites. Being able to manage a diverse caseload, and often in different settings. So your client presentations can be quite different. Certainly being responsible for and taking ownership of their own learning is a very critical thing when you explore a little bit more into the detail of the capabilities. Resilience again comes up, and that's dealing with adverse reactions, being able to deal, and particularly in a rural and remote setting, perhaps all the climatic changes that farmers and rural communities are facing, all of those other things which are tapping into the students' capacity to hold themselves together in a way. Understanding their communities. Self-reflection is a very important one. Being able to learn from your mistakes, take a positive note from that, take a lesson and moving forward rather than taking a defeatist approach and it's never going to get better. So these were some of the themes that actually emerged. Some of them are more personal characteristics, other are more process issues. So using different communication platforms, but they all come together to enable a person, a student, to flourish as a new graduate in a particular setting. So for future research, what learning opportunities during placement will explicitly develop these capabilities? How can we measure growth in these capabilities? Are these capabilities developed because of a placement in a rural setting, or are they prerequisites for rural practice? So that's another question. We have a national physiotherapy assessment tool, and it's very generic because it applies across all settings like cardiothoracics, in a hospital, outpatients, aged care, paediatrics. But because it's so generic, does it lack the richness that might be a feature of a rural or remote practice placement experience? Do we need to add some additional performance descriptors specific to rural, remote, regional practice? And do these findings have implications for teaching in our Charles Sturt University program for the physiotherapy students and potentially across allied health? And I think that's where, as I said, sometimes you get more questions than answers, but I would like to say thank you very much to the Three Rivers Department of Rural Health, in particular, Associate Professor Melissa Knott and Stephanie Nelson for their direction and support in gathering the information and preparing the findings for this session today, and also a report for the university.
Terrific. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Rosemary. That was really interesting. And it looks like you've got some fascinating research to follow up on.
We have, yes.
If you could stop sharing your screen, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. Done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll move on to Yazdan Mansourian, who's going to talk to us about Wenger's theory of communities of practice and work-integrated learning. So Yazdan, when you're ready, you can share your screen and begin your presentation.
Right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Linda, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for attending this presentation. I'm grateful for your presence. Today, I'm talking about my experience of embedding the theory of communities of interest into my teaching practice, and I reflect on a number of results and students' feedback. So, and I focus on the concept of locality in this theory. Talking about locality, I would like to share a story with you. This is a tree in the area that I live in, Estella, in Wagga Wagga, on the top of Avosted Drive. And this tree has been part of my daily walk every morning and evening with my dog, Rebel, who is a retired farm dog, a border collie. So, and I used to took photos of this tree. And I have a collection of photos of the same tree in my mobile in different seasons, different time. You can see sunny days, you know, sunsets, so that sort of things. Around 2 weeks ago, the tree fell over as a result of a storm. I heard the news in our Facebook group in our community in Estella. I didn't know that. Someone posted a photo and said, the tree, just the tree, you know, fell over an hour ago. And within a few hours, so many photos actually people posted and lots of comments. And then in that moment, I realized I was not the only one looking at this tree. I was not the only one who admired its beauty, its elegance, the only one who, you know, felt the sense of loneliness it has over there. There were many other people doing the same thing, but no one talked to me about this tree until the moment it fell over. So basically, we had a shared passion, we had a shared interest in a community without talking about it, in silence, you know? So, but that's so powerful. It means there are so many things we share. There are so many things we have a collective concern, collective passion about it, but not necessarily talking about it. So that's the beauty of these collective understanding, collective, you know, realizing together. So, and now this tree, the photo of the tree is the background of our Facebook, group in Estella with more than 5,000 members. So, yeah, that's locality. That's talking about the concept of communities of interest, communities of practice. When I began my teaching at CSU 7 years ago, because I used to teach the same subjects in Iran, in my home country, for 10 years in Persian, so I'm teaching the same subjects in English. So that's the only difference. So then I started thinking about different kind of theories that I can embed into my practice, because as Kurt Lewin says, there is nothing more practical than a good theory. We always have a theory regardless of what we do. Sometimes we don't realize, but we have a theory about what we do. And one of the theory that I really liked was this book by um, Ethan Wenger, Communities of Practice, Learning, Meaning, and Identity, published by Cambridge University Press in 1998. This is a wonderful book. And I use this theory in my teaching in general, and here I'm talking in particular about how I used it in my workplace learning subjects, because for the past 2 years, I am in charge of workplace learning or work integrated learning subjects in our school, a school of information and communication studies. So, and now I'm talking about that experience. So let's have a quick look at the theory first. This is the theory, page 5 of this book is still there. And this is here. So you can see that's my reference ready here. So he's talking about learning from different perspective. Learning as belonging. So it manifests community. When we learn together, when we learn from each other. Learning as identity, learning as becoming. So we learn something to become someone. We learn to become university lecturer. We learn to become an information professional. So we are forming our identity by our learning. Then he's talking about meaning, learning as experience. Whatever we learn is supposed to be meaningful, purposeful. What is the point of learning something meaningless? We make meaning out of what we learn anyway. And finally, learning as doing as a practice. And he, in his book, in the second part of his book, he's talking about practice, just practice, and he identifies 5 aspects of practice: meaning, community, learning, boundary, and locality. In these 10 minutes, I don't have time to talk about the first 4. I'm sure you know better than me. These are topics that you are very familiar with that. I'm just focusing on locality. So locality is a dynamic concept that is being used in many disciplines. People in physics talking about locality, people in mathematics, people in ecology, in sociology. We all talk about locality in one way or another. But when we are talking about learning, communities of practice, locality can have different manifestations. So I embedded this concept of locality in workplace learning in different parts of my teaching practice, in my online classes, in my assignments, in the way that I mark, in my tutorial with the students, and I encourage them to, when they are doing their professional placement across the GLAM sector, because our school, our discipline, information science, our area of practice includes libraries, galleries, archives, and museum record management. So we call it GLAM sector. So I encourage them to remember the concept of locality. Of course, it was not the only thing that I said. It was one of the things that I highlighted. So, and I said, there is always opportunity for you. For example, if you are doing your placement in a public library, in a regional town in Australia, why you are not looking on local history? Engage in a local history project. Think about what's happening, what is there, what forms their identity, what forms their belongingness, what is specific and unique about that area. So, and then the results showed that they like it in their, basically assessment. I could see that, and I gave feedback to them, and they engaged with it. They engaged with it, and basically the concept of locality was very obvious in the whole process of workplace learning. And I conclude that locality provides a framework for building resilience among people who are engaging communities of practice. And I believe that locality influences the specific knowledge and practice basically that are relevant to the community. And finally, locality contributes to the community's identity, which is very important. So I think that was 10 minutes. I stop sharing, and thank you for your attention and looking for your questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yazdan. That was really interesting. And I also loved the story about the tree and thought how wonderful it is in this day and age of chopping them down left, right, and centre, that such a large community was focused on the well-being of a tree. Very nice to know that it still happens. Okay, we have one more presentation today, which is Stacey Jones, and she will be talking about enhancing teacher education students' readiness for professional experience placement and employment. So welcome, Stacey, and you're up.
Thank you, Linda. Just checking my screen's visible to everyone. We're all up, systems go. Thank you to all the previous presenters. I think what's really evident is we're in a community of practice right here, in that we're also interested in our students' learning experience. So thank you. I've loved all the presentations, and I'm looking forward to telling you. I know today's all about radical reimagination, but I'm going to pose that perhaps what I did isn't really reimagining it. I think it's kind of common sense, but it certainly had an impact on our students. So I work in teacher education, in workplace learning, and for many years worked in schools. And so I'm going to ask you the question today, the question that I was asking myself for years: are we in university preparing teachers for the real world of teaching? So during degrees, we send them off for placements in schools. And for years, as a school teacher, I was asking that question. So to illustrate the problem that I am looking at today, I'll introduce you to a fictional teacher education student named Sarah. And imagine you are Sarah, and you're maybe in your second or third year of your degree, and you're getting ready to go on your first teaching experience in a school. How do you think she'd be feeling? What thoughts would she be having, and what obstacles do you think she might face? So I'd like you to imagine that you're a fly on the wall of a classroom watching a conversation unfold between Sarah and her supervising teacher. It looks a little like this. So Sarah is slumped in her chair. She's utterly exhausted from her first day of teaching during placement. Her meticulously planned lesson is in a crumpled mess, mirroring the chaos of her first day teaching. The classroom noise, Students glued to their mobile phones, don't we hear about that so much? Yawning during her lessons, disinterested in what she was teaching them, is playing on repeat in her mind. The fighting, the bullying, it was overwhelming. Her supervisor, who looks remarkably like me, simply states, look, it was a rough first day. It's a real baptism of fire. Sarah nods. She's somewhat shell-shocked. The weight of the day is pressing down on her and the pressure of being assessed whilst on this placement. University was all theories and neat lesson plans. Nothing prepared her for this. The constant demands, the lack of support, the pressure to pass this placement, it all felt too much. It didn't feel like teaching. It almost felt like trying to tame a storm. And this was her first day ever of teaching. Now, there's lots of crossover with this story in the previous presentations, and whilst you weren't talking about teaching, we're still talking about that same jump. And I think it was Robin talked about it being, oh no, Rosemary, sorry, said we throw them into the deep end when we send them out to schools, and we truly do, whether it's a school or a hospital. So what I'm talking about today is this idea of praxis shock that we experience in many industries when we leave the safe confines of university and go out into the real world. So I'd like you to just have a think for a minute. Where have you experienced this or witnessed this, where there's that gap between theoretical knowledge and the practical realities of a job? And I'm sure we all can think of that in our own unique context. So that was the problem that I identified, and it's not a new one, but I wanted to look at how well or how we can better prepare our pre-service teachers for their professional experience placement. So there's been a lot of talk about what we do whilst they're on placement. My research, this particular research, looked at what can we do at the university setting to better prepare them so when they arrive on these placements, they're a little bit more prepared and a little bit more confident, because we are very reliant, as we are in all industries, on the mentoring they get once they get into these settings, and we don't have a lot of influence over the quality. So what did we do? I'm here to tell you about a partnership that has been in place for many years now between a local secondary school and a Charles Sturt campus. What we did is we said, okay, if we want to better prepare them, let's get a teacher from the school who's skilled and experienced and bring them into the university setting and pair them up with an academic. And so that's what we did for several years. And the two of them co-designed and team taught in university tutorials. And this was prior to the students going out on placement. What we did is when we got together, we looked at what they were learning before they went on placement. And it was the teacher that came in and said, well, when do they actually practice teaching before they come to us? And we realized that they weren't getting those opportunities. So we embedded numerous authentic learning experiences into our tutorials, and I'll tell you what they were all about in a minute. And we're always looking at those accreditation standards, and every industry, again, has them, aligning what we were planning with the Australian professional standards for teachers. So I haven't got a lot of time to go into authentic learning theory, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. But I'm sure when you reflect on your learning at some stage, there would have been some authentic learning there. And it's about providing them with practical experiences that mirror what they'll find when they arrive out in industry. So what we did, there were three core sort of authentic learning activities we embedded throughout the semester. We gave them opportunities to team teach. So we put them in small groups and pairs, and they would have little mini lessons in the tutorial where we effectively handed tutorials over to them. And then their peers gave them feedback, and that was beautiful. It was non-assessable. We could press pause when things weren't going well. We got to play the role of naughty students. Everyone had a ball. It was really enjoyable. We then took them out into school sites, and this was really valuable. So we had established relationships with the academic and the teacher, and that teacher then took all of the students into the school, but they didn't have to teach. They weren't being assessed. It was a very relaxed setting, and they just got to watch experienced teachers and students interact, get involved in a little bit of sport, but they didn't need to lead anything. So it was really safe and low stakes. We then stole a classroom and did debriefs right then and there on site. And so they got to experience a contemporary school, which was fantastic. And then the last thing, they already had an assessment, which was putting a portfolio together. But we took it a step further. We brought principals into the uni, and again, in small groups, we did mock employment interviews. So they would be asked a question, they could refer to their evidence that they had in their assessment and speak to that artifact and listen to their peers give responses as well. And it was a really lovely big peer feedback circle. So again, it demystified what it was to talk to other professionals, particularly principals. They seem to be very scared of principals, and just talk the lingo with other teacher professionals. So they were the main three activities. Very briefly, we engaged in a qualitative case study approach to this research. Our participants, importantly to note, yes, it was our students at the university, but we were looking at employment readiness. And so we also spoke to principals to see what they thought as well. We had the student surveys at the end of the semester, but we also had interviews with principals and students and their reflections. And then we themed the data according to the standards. In summary, our key findings were that the students had stronger theory practice connections as a result of the authentic learning. They did say they felt more confident and prepared to go on placement, which was fantastic. And interestingly, a lot of people have spoken about identity today. They were seeing themselves as teachers already before they even entered into a school. They were talking like teachers. And so there was a really noticeable shift in their professional identity from student to teacher, which was really exciting. Very quickly, their own words, a few of them said things like, we felt like we got real hands-on real world experience and applications for what we're learning. We didn't know what we didn't know kind of thing. And my favorite quote, they felt they had a toolkit to go on to their next placement. So they had skills and resources and things they could draw on when they got to that classroom that they could actually use, which sounds fantastic. That's what you would expect from a university degree. The way forward, look, I'd love to see more teachers included in the planning and delivery of teacher education courses to just remain relevant, and for universities to support that, and for the contribution of teachers in higher ed to be supported through policy. And of course, for the people in the room that aren't teachers, would love to see authentic learning in other fields as well, where we can embed it, because it definitely has an impact. Hopefully under 10 minutes, I didn't look at the clock. Thank you to the AG RTP Scholarship and the Waratah Scholarship for supporting this and other research I'm involved in this space. And thanks to everyone for listening. And sorry I spoke fast, but time is of the essence.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much, Stacey. And you did come in about 2 minutes under 10.
Oh, good.
Well, you had a couple more minutes left. Thank you very much. They were 4 very interesting presentations today. So now we've got about just under 15 minutes left to have some question and answer. Who would like to kick off? Does anyone out there have a question they would like to ask one of our presenters? You can put your hand up by using the React button at the bottom of the screen. You click on React and raise hand. Okay, if not, then I will go back to the beginning of my notes, because I had a couple of questions along the way. So this is going back to Robin. I hope Robin's still here.
I am.
Hi there.
Hi.
I really enjoyed your work around neurodivergence and WPL. I thought that was really interesting. And I loved the pedagogy of kindness. I particularly wanted to say that because I thought, what a gorgeous term. I hadn't heard it before, but it was just lovely. So I had a couple of questions around what happens if the place that WPL is happening, the workplace, is not supportive of introducing new practices and processes to support neurodivergent people. How does that play out for you?
That's an excellent question. So far, we have only placed our neurodivergent students in laboratories where they are supportive and happy to take them on. In saying that, we don't necessarily have to disclose the neurodivergence to the laboratory. Like, obviously that's up to the student whether or not we disclose that they're neurodivergent. But we haven't had any issues so far. We've had one student who was happy to disclose their neurodivergence and another who didn't want to, but I just posed it as, you know, some of our students like to have icebreaker meetings and check-ins, and sort of just pose it as we do this for some of our students. And so far it's been hugely successful. Everybody's been incredibly supportive of the flexible working arrangements, the check-ins, and yeah, it's been successful. I'm sure we will have times going forward where we have hiccups, but so far it's been very good.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much for that.
Thanks.
Excuse me. And Rosemary,
Mm.
I think you were next. Yes. I had a question for you about
Mhm.
whether it's possible for you to do a comparison between rural and non-rural clinical supervision. And particularly, I think you mentioned it in your presentation that clinical supervisors in rural communities have this, particular approach or needs. And I wondered if there was research or if you were contemplating doing research comparing between rural and non-rural.
We could certainly do that. I think there is a lot more evidence around working in a metropolitan centre. I mean, and I think a lot of that is driven by the rural schools, which are very embedded within the medical program. But because of our footprint, that was my focus at the time. But certainly it could warrant. But I think we go back to the fundamental. If you look at the capabilities, they are essentially the same. But it's the nuances in each of those that might be the distinguishing factor, because I think that's a great question, but I would still say flexibility is important at the Children's Hospital in Sydney, just as much as it's important at Forbes Parks.
Yeah.
But what underpins it is probably the difference, I think. Yeah.
I was thinking about the support mechanisms that might be available in a centrally located children's hospital versus the support mechanisms that might be available in a broader based rural or regional hospital.
I think it's probably the timing and the location. They're just next door, whereas in rural they're probably 2 hours that way and 1 hour that way. So I think so there's a lot of you could probably look at the capability may be the same, but it's the organisational and the process issues which are probably going to be quite different, I would think. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
great presentation and great research. Thank you very much for sharing it with us. Yazdan, your tree. I'm going to think about that tree for days, I think. It was just beautiful. And I love some of the terms you came up with, like learning as belonging, learning as identity, learning as becoming. It was just a really lovely way of thinking about the different things that learning achieves for students and for all of us. So the questions I had was, would it be interesting or would it be possible to investigate locality in terms of a lot of the Facebook social groups that crop up that are based on locality? So I'm in Bathurst, and there is a Bathurst Our Town Facebook group. It's got about 30,000 members. It's very active. There's a lot of really useful, interesting community information and a lot of help seeking and help giving that goes across the group. So I wondered if that would fit with your approach to locality as a community of practice or a community of interest. Had you thought about it, and would it be, beneficial?
Yes. Basically, community of practice can form in different platforms, basically. So, for example, we might have, because when we are talking about community of practice, it has different aspects. So, for example, we have community of practice virtually in terms of they interact with each other, in terms of they share information. So, for example, for research, I researched about the different hobbies in Australia, for example, bonsai growers. So they have all forms of virtual groups and forums, and they keep exchanging information and knowledge. They have their online shows, they have their online exhibitions, virtual workshops. So yeah, answering your question, absolutely. This community of practice can be formed. It's happening at the moment, in virtual platforms like Facebook or other social media.
Okay, good. Well, I'll look forward to seeing more research come out on that, and I am going to go and find that book and have a look at it because it sounds really interesting and it sounds like it's got some fascinating information in it. Murray Rose, you have a question.
Yeah, hi everyone, and hi Stacey, good to see you again. I had a question for you because I know you did a lot of work. I was actually one of the supervisors for some of these teachers at the local high school back in the day. I know you did a lot of work with the schools on preparing us to receive these
Yeah.
students. Did you find that either way worked better? Because these students obviously then go out to a broad range of schools. But I think for me personally, I found it quite a valuable experience to be prepared for, I guess, what I should expect from pre-service teachers as well. I think that was something that I personally found very valuable.
How exciting to have you in the room. Stop it. Yeah, look, I can't say one approach is better than the other. So for those in the room that my case study doctoral research is looking at numerous initiatives, and this is one of them. Look, they're just a different approach to, it's all about enhancing the placement experience to enhance teacher quality. So I suppose there's numerous ways to approach it. Of course, if the supervisor is better prepared, then the student is going to be able to settle into that environment. But I think it doesn't matter how well prepared the supervisors are, you still can't remove praxis shock. And I feel like I'm really uniquely positioned now in workplace learning as a supervisor there, that when things go wrong, they come to me. So I get that anecdotal sort of evidence as well. And the things that go wrong, and it's just again and again, is I didn't think schools would be like this, because our students, you know, they think that when they teach, the school will be the same as what it was for them. And most of the time it's not. And I'm finding that the main reason for people not passing placement or not finishing placement is expectations are way out of alignment for what they actually find in a school setting. So I think that both approaches have a place. This research is great because it just, this initiative, it's just, it is a little bit ridiculous that they go into a school and they may have never taught a lesson to anyone ever. Like that to me just seems preposterous, but it does happen. So I think we can approach it both ways. Yeah.
Great
Thanks,
question.
Stacey.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Terrific. Stacey, I had a question, and this is around some media that's been around recently about female teachers leaving the teaching profession because they're increasingly being confronted with really quite serious misogynistic and sexist behaviour in the classroom. And I wondered if your research encompassed ways to challenge this or to deal with it, and or whether it might be something that you would bring into your program in the future.
Oh, look, it's not something I'm looking at my particular research. It's more a holistic sort of understanding of what they're stepping into. Look, issues like that do come up. And this is the beauty of bringing those current skilled educators or teachers into the tutorials, because if that's happening in a school right now and we are having them come into our tutorials and can talk to us about those experiences, then it brings that lens and that reality. You know, the full disclosure, the teacher that was coming in was me, and so I was being honest with all of my students, and it was a no holds barred approach. I told them everything I was experiencing, and that is one thing that I did experience, Linda. I had some disgraceful behaviour on behalf of older male students in particular, and so I would tell them. And I think that once you know what you're in for, and you hear those stories, you can prepare a little bit. But the other beautiful thing about the university space, as I highlighted, is they weren't being assessed. And so it was a very honest, safe space for reflection. The minute you're with a supervising teacher, they are pass or fail for you. Yeah. And so you're never going to be able to have that same relationship with your supervising teacher as much as you'd like to. So it's just about that. I explain it as they get to dip their toe into teaching and have that little bit of space with a teacher without being in a school yet. So it's just a lovely gradual exposure.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was really interesting. So that brings us to the end of our session today, and I'd like to thank all of our presenters for giving us some really good food for thought and presenting us with some interesting research and concepts. I'd also like to thank everyone who has attended and listened today. Thank you very much for your attention. In terms of closing out this session, I've been asked to let you know that the conference closed session link is here. I've realised now that you can't actually do anything with it, but there is a conference closed session, and Kamala has asked me to remind everyone about it. And the last thing, of course, is the CSEdX 2024 feedback. If you would kindly complete that. And that's it. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? No? Okay. That's been lovely. Thank you very much, everyone. It's been a really interesting and informative session. And thank you again to all of our presenters who did a great job. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.